Let's start with the sequence diagrams for adding members and books. These were also the first couple of use cases that we looked at. So let's talk about registering members. Now we see that we need one more physical class, that is the user interface, which should be dealing with the actor, the library staff member, and receive details of the member. So we have the user interface dealing with the actor, but then after getting the details of the member, like name, address, and phone number, the member object has to be created. We assume that we decided that there is going to be a physical class called member. The question is, where should the member object be created? Some choices are the user interface, the library, member list. I can't think of anything else that is remotely eligible to create the member object. Or, for example, the book class should not be creating a member, right? It doesn't make any sense. One would be surprised if that was the case, and it would be throwing off the person who is looking at the design, So you shouldn't be doing those kinds of things. Among these three, which is the best choice? Let's look at the user interface. The user interface is supposed to be dealing with the user and then asking the business logic to do certain things so that the functionality is achieved. It should not be dealing with, it should not be carrying out business logic. Creating a member object is actually saying, the way a member object has to be created, the constructor, the parameters to the constructor, etc. So this is not the best place to create the member object. This would be a bad idea because it introduces unnecessary coupling, that is dependence of the user interface onto the business logic. User interface should not be interfering with the business logic. It should not be carrying out business logic. Member list. Member list is a collection. A collections task is to store information, retrieve information, delete information, support traversing the data, etc. It is not supposed to be creating information. So this is also not the best place to create a member object. So we are left with the library. So that is what we will do. We will create the member object in the library class, and the library should then know how to create a member, what the parameters to the constructor are, whether the constructor throws an exception, all those things. So the library class is going to be dependent, is going to be coupled to the member class. And that is something we have to live with. As you will see, there is going to be coupling because we have multiple classes. The moment you have two or more classes, you are going to introduce coupling. So the general philosophy in this library system is that this library class will be coupled to many other classes, but the other classes will not be coupled to each other to any great extent. That is one of the design philosophies we have used in this design. So let's now talk about the sequence diagram for adding a member. Well, when you draw a sequence diagram, you are actually coming up with the logic that gets executed across multiple objects. So you have to kind of start wondering, who are all the players that are involved in the adding of a member? Well, obviously the actor has to be involved. The clerk has to be involved because the clerk is the one who is issuing the requests. And those requests go to the user interface. And we also said the library will be supporting all the functionality of the physical library, right? So the library object has to be there. We have to create member object. So there is going to be a member object created. So that is another object. Finally, the member object that is created must be stored in a collection class. So we need member list. So there are 4 objects, software objects, and of course the actor. So those are the 4 things. But you can see that these 3 are at the top. The clerk, of course, is interacting with the user interface. So how do you understand this sequence diagram? At the top, we have a few objects. These are objects: the user interface object, library object, and member list object. And there is only one instance of each one of these, so there is no need to say what the object name is or object ID is or anything of that kind. And you can see that there is a rectangle here under each one of these objects, and they represent the period during which each object is active. So this is the period during which user interface is active. This is the period during which library is active. And this is the period during which member list object is active. The member object is not at the same level as these other 3. The reason is this member object is created later in the use case. It is not existing at the beginning of the use case, right? We should be creating the member object as part of the sequence diagram. So that comes a little later in the process. So it is put here. We will see the point at which it gets created. We will see the creation process in a minute. Then you can see these dotted lines. These show that the user interface is existing right at the beginning, and it continues to exist. You can see this dotted line at the bottom that shows that it is continuing to exist even after the use case is over. That is the case with the library and the member list. The sequence diagram is marginally sloppy. I don't have that dotted line at the bottom here. The other thing is these rectangles, the period during which they are active are extending a little more than they should be. There should be, for example, this rectangle under library should be starting only at this point when it gets the request to add a member, and should be ending at this point when it is returning the result. Similarly for the other ones too. There is a little bit of sloppiness, I would admit, with respect to this sequence diagram. And let's see how this whole thing flows. This is the final product. Please remember that. This is not how it was when we started thinking about it. We tried different things and finally we came up with this. So this is not reflecting the different iterations of developing the sequence diagram. So as you know, time increases as we go down. The first thing the cloud does is issues a request to add a member. And you can see that there is a message coming from the user interface with a half arrow saying it is an asynchronous message waiting for a response, and data request, and the user enters the name, address, and phone. Then after that is done, you can see the next action is the user interface issues a request to the library, and that is to add a member. That request is called add member, and it passes the name, address, and phone in that order. Now, let's pause and take a good look at this. This is a request, as we just said, from the user interface going to the library, and we called that request add member. Eventually, add member will be a method in library. So we are saying, what we are saying is the user interface object is issuing the add member method on the library and passes 3 things as parameters. So we are defining the signature of the add member method in library. Since this is the library object, this add member would be a method in the library class. And after receiving this message, a little later, you can see this message going from library to the member class, creating the member object. So this is a constructor call, the name, address, and phone. So we are defining the signature of, we only have one constructor in member of the member class, and what we get is a member object in return. And since this is actually a creation of an object and it doesn't happen until this point, that is the reason why member is not up here. After getting the member object, library adds that member object. You can see that the member object I'm calling member, and that is added to the member list, which is a collection. And the member is passed as the only parameter to a method called insert member. And we are saying this should come back with a true or false indication. And that result is passed back from the library to the user interface, and from the user interface, the result is displayed. You can see that this sequence diagram shows the essential details of what happens. It doesn't show all the details. For example, it doesn't tell, for example, what is this Boolean supposed to be? You're supposed to be sophisticated enough to judge that insert member returns true if insertion was successful, otherwise it returns false. And this doesn't clearly say what the result is going to be. One could be more specific here. You can be as specific as you wish. That depends on the need or the understanding between different parts of the design team and between the design team and the implementation team. So how specific one should get? We are not being very specific here. Maybe this will come back as a Boolean, or this could come back as an object. In fact, what we are going to do is look at the use case and say that this must be the member object. Because if you pass the member object back, you can examine that and display information from the member object, things like the ID. And the clerk can see the information that was stored. Now, you will see that we don't need as much explanation for many of these other sequence diagrams. This is our first sequence diagram for the library system. So we spent a little more time addressing some basic issues like the placement of the objects, or which objects should be part of the sequence diagram, and some of the issues related to the specificity of the return types and so on. The next sequence diagram is adding books, and this is very similar in some respects to adding a member, because we have some common agents like the clerk and the user interface and library, but then we are creating a member in the add member sequence diagram, and we have a member list. Instead, we have the catalog and the book for obvious reasons. The flow is very similar, as you can see here. You invoke the add books functionality. The user interface asks for the data. The clerk enters title, author, and ID. Then we invent a method called add book with title, author, and ID as parameters. This creates the book object, and that is inserted into the catalog. And the result is passed back to the clerk. So in that respect, things are very similar to add member. But what is different here is a new concept. If you recall from the use case, we can add multiple books. That has to be reflected in the sequence diagram. So we have the addition of a book in a box. The whole process of requesting for the data, supplying the title, author ID, all these method calls, returning the result, displaying the result, etc., are all put into this box here. And that is a loop. I can tell because there is this little indication in the top left corner saying this whole thing is to be repeated. It doesn't really tell what the terminating condition is. Again, we are kind of expecting the person reading this to know that this is done as long as this query, add more books, is answered in the affirmative. If you start putting all the details, then this would be very difficult to read. There will be far too many details. So we can't put all the details here. We can't put all the exception conditions here. But if you don't put a certain amount of detail, this is totally vague, totally useless. So it can be useless if there is too much information. It can be useless if there is too little information. So you have to find the right balance. The other thing is, as you create more and more use cases, you will start seeing that a single class like the library would have many methods. So you will gather all these methods and then put them into the class diagram for library. Similarly, we see that insert book has to be a method in catalog, or insert member has to be a member of member list. That member has to have this constructor, and so on. So after we finish all the sequence diagrams, we can draw the class diagram by capturing the information we have in the sequence diagram.